Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Geoffrey Owen, and I have the pleasure of chairing this evening's session and introducing our speaker, Lord Sainsbury. As many of you will know, Lord Sainsbury has had a remarkable career straddling the worlds of business, government, and philanthropy. He worked for many years for the company that bears his family name, J. Sainsbury plc. In fact, some of you may not know that the first Sainsbury shop was opened in 1869, a few yards from here in Drury Lane, selling high-quality milk. That's his main asset. He held a number of senior jobs in Sainsbury's, finance director, and then he served as chairman between 1992 and 1998. I think at the end of that year, during that year, he was appointed Minister of Science and Innovation in Tony Blair's Labour government, and he held that post until 2006. Now, during that period and subsequently, since leaving that job, he's been deeply interested in issues that are absolutely central to today's debate about the future of the British economy. How to make better use of the UK's great strengths in academic science, how to promote innovation, how to remove the obstacles that stand in the way of a more innovative, more productive economy. His thoughts on these topics are set out in an important book that he's just published, Progressive Capitalism: How to Achieve Economic Growth, Liberty and Social Justice. Some of you may have seen copies of the book outside the lecture room, and Lord Sainsbury will be happy to sign copies at the end of the session when we finish it at 8 o'clock. Given the uncertainties about the British economy and indeed about British politics, this book could hardly be more timely. And we very much look forward to hearing Lord Sainsbury setting out some of the themes that he explores in that book. He's going to talk for about 25 minutes or half an hour or so. The two of us will then have a brief dialogue for perhaps another 15 minutes before opening the floor to the audience, and we will continue until 8 o'clock. So could I ask Lord Sainsbury to come and talk to us? Thank you.
Geoffrey, thank you very much for those kind words. I think if one inflicts another book on economics on the public, you have to have a very good excuse for doing this. There are plenty out there, and why do you need another one? I have two excuses. The first is that a lot of books have been written recently on the financial crash of 2008, on the end of neoliberalism, and so on. But I think no one, as far as I know, has written up about an alternative political economy, that is, an alternative view of the role of the state in the economy, and that's what my book seeks to do. Secondly, if you look at most books on political economy, they set out a political economy, or they seek to attack another political economy. They very rarely go from, this is the political economy we're recommending or attacking, and the consequences of this are the following in policy terms. In my book, the first half, I try and put forward an alternative political economy, and then the second half, I explain how this might be used to produce better policies for the UK at this present time. Let me just, probably this is one place which I will be talking at in these days, where I don't need necessarily to explain what neoliberalism is, but just so there's no misunderstanding of this, neoliberalism that I'm talking about is really a combination of two things, neoclassical economic thinking plus a very strong kind of libertarian streak and a belief that governments really can't pursue the public interest or can't promote the public interest because everyone who's part of the government is pursuing their own self-interest. That's what I mean by neoliberalism. Having said that, I have to say that during the 8 years I was a minister in the DTI, I very much subscribed, like practically everyone in government, like practically the whole of the academic world, like practically the whole of the business community, essentially to a neoliberal view of the day. And I believed as a whole government was doing pretty well. The economy seemed to be growing and be very buoyant, and everything seemed to be moving along very smoothly. And it was only after I left government that three events caused me really to start thinking as to whether we had been on the right lines or whether there were major flaws in this particular political economy we were following. First of all, I came out of government. I left government in November 2006, and I then was not allowed to talk to any financial advisors for 3 months on the rather bizarre argument that, having been a member of the DTI, I was privy to a lot of really useful information which would enable me to make lots of money on the stock market. If you knew anything about the information we had in the DTI, this was a very improbable situation. But in any case, I was only in about March, April 2007 that I came out of government and I talked to the financial advisors who I hadn't talked to for 8 years because all my investments had to be in a blind trust. And after they pointed out that they'd made a lot more money while I was in government and unable to interfere in matters, they then said, we're quite worried about what's happening in financial markets. We think the whole thing has become too complicated and people have lost control of what they're doing. And there's also this thing called subprime mortgages, which is a small cloud on the horizon, but we think could turn into something very big. And I remember thinking at the time, do I go and talk to Alistair or Gordon and tell them that doesn't look outside the same as it appears to look in the Treasury or the DTI? And then I thought that's ridiculous. Of course, they should know. That again was a fairly obvious mistake. The second thing that made me think about these issues was there was a private equity bid for the family business. And this was, I thought, an extraordinary situation because there was no attempt to say, we will take over this company and improve its performance. They basically said, we will keep the management, we think it's been well run, we think we will keep its capital expenditure program, we will keep its strategy, we'll keep all these things. All we'll do is we'll buy the company, we'll strip out all the property, which we'll sell, we will stuff the company with debt, and then we'll put it back on the market, forgetting to tell people of the risks involved in this, and walk away with £1 billion. And that seemed to me was something which was completely dysfunctional as far as financial markets is concerned, and a classic example not of wealth creation, but simply wealth appropriation. It's not about creating wealth, it's simply about transferring wealth from one person to the other without any contribution to innovation or wealth creation. The third incident which obviously affected my thinking was the financial crash of 2008, because it seemed to me that as governments rushed around frantically trying to save the world's financial system, it was simply not intellectually possible to go on saying that markets are self-correcting, self-regulating, and there is no role for government. Clearly, it was not you could not any longer sustain that point of view. And so what I thought we needed to do at this point was to rethink the political economy that we had had over all those years and produce a new progressive political economy, which I've called progressive capitalism. At this point, I think I need to say what I mean by capitalism, because, as I'm sure you know, you can read many books about the origins of capitalism, varieties of capitalism, the future of capitalism, and not ever get a very clear definition of what you mean by capitalism. I think you can define it by two features. The first feature is that the majority of productive assets are actually held by individuals, and they're held by individuals, and that is seen as a good thing, because individuals will take greater care about the productive use of those assets. So that's the first feature of capitalism. The second is that it is a system where the production is guided and the income is distributed largely through the operation of markets. Now, this is important because an absolute cornerstone of the case I'm making for progressive capitalism is a firm belief in capitalism. Some people, I think, would like to say this is a book which is an attack on capitalism. It isn't. It should be, in a way, seen as a defense of capitalism, because what it's saying is there are flaws in the model of capitalism we have at the moment, but these are not inherent in it. These are flaws which can be corrected, and capitalism still remains the best economic system that we have. At the same time, progressive capitalism includes three beliefs, of defining beliefs, I would describe them as, of progressive thinking. The first of these is the crucial role of institutions. The second is the need for the state to be involved in the design of institutions in order to resolve conflicting interests and provide public goods. And the third is the use of social justice, which I define as fairness, as an important measure of a country's economic performance. So it's those three defining beliefs of progressivism which are very important into the argument. I think a great mistake of neoclassical economists is not to see that capitalism is a socio-economic system. It's a great mistake because if you look at the growth of different countries at different times across the world, if you look at the empirical studies, what you will see is that at least four kinds of institutions have been enormously important in determining that level of growth and speed of growth. And if you just rule those out of your models of capitalism, then they have very little, if any, predictive value. Those four institutions are, first of all, the institutions which underpin financial and labour markets, the institutions which underpin the governance of firms, a country's education and training system, and its national system of innovation. National system of innovation being the network of institutions in the public and private sectors whose activities and interventions initiate, import, modify, and diffuse new technologies. For example, when Mrs. Thatcher changed the industrial relations law in this country, she didn't return it to some natural state, some basic primitive natural state. She simply changed the rules and the regulations in a way which, depending on your political view, made it more unfair or more fair to everyone. So that was a case of a major institutional change, and obviously an extremely important one. I think also that the performance of any company is very much affected by the way that it's governed. Whether it takes a long-term investment view or focuses solely on quarterly results, whether it's prepared to put resources into training young people, and depends on how well it's governed and its relationship with shareholders. And I believe that in spite of Cadbury report and the masses of, well, the number of reports that original report spawned, we have actually a system of corporate governance today in this country which does not work very well. In fact, I think you can see that some parts of it are very largely out of control. I'd give two examples of that. The first is simply the pay of executives. Whether it's at the right level or not, it can be debated, but it seems to me it's very clearly out of control and not related as it should be to performance. For example, while I was in government, that's between roughly 1999 and 2006, the salaries earned by the chief executive of FTSE 100 companies rose every year by 11%, while at the same time, most full-time employees were getting increases of about 1.4%, 1.1% per year in that period. And I don't think you can look back and say the performance of companies over that period increased at that kind of rate. What that was due to was some badly designed compensation schemes which related it to a very buoyant market, and that was allowed to run and give these huge increases. And I think also, if you look at what's happening to our companies, it's quite clear that they're taking more and more short-term view and not investing for the long term, and that again is, I think, a sign that our governance of companies has become rather dysfunctional. And in my book, I make some suggestions about how one might try and deal with that, and bring essentially the investors and the shareholders once again closer and in touch with the companies. Because what we've seen in recent years is a vast growth of intermediation between investors on the one hand and the companies on the other. So that, for example, if you say to an asset manager today, I want you to take an interest and to vote the shares of a company, they will say, that's an extra charge. That's not what we normally do. And this seems to me a breakdown on what is a fundamental part of capitalism, which is the linkage between the people who own the productive assets and the managers of the company. Just to give you another example of an institution which I think works incredibly badly in this country and has done for 100 years, and that is our system for training technicians. You will probably know that the first reports which said Germany has much better technicians than this country, the first report comes from Prince Albert. And for the last 100 years, we have had endless reports that the technician system doesn't work. And that's not because our young people are lazy or not well motivated. It's because we do not have a proper system which meets the three needs for good technical education, which are a national standard which works in the marketplace. Everyone knows that that is a national standard, and if you have that qualification and go to a company, they value that and will take you on, as opposed to someone who doesn't, which is obviously essential in any system of qualifications, because young people will not work hard to get a qualification if when they take it to an employee, the employee says, I really couldn't care less whether you've got it. So the first thing is a national standard which works in the marketplace. Secondly, you have to find a way of paying young people while they get these qualifications. And thirdly, you have to have places and teachers who can teach them the knowledge of the skills. And in this country, in spite of all these efforts and reports, we have none of those three things which are essential and which is very important in terms of our economic performance. The second defining belief of progressive thinking is that the state has to be involved in the design and reform of a country's institutions. Institutions do not evolve spontaneously, as neoliberals believe. The state has to be involved because there are conflicting interests in the participants in markets, and also, in other cases, there are public goods which the state has to provide. You can think of any number of examples of cases where there are conflicting interests. While I was in the DTI, I had to take the 2006 Company Bill through the House of Lords. Which took some 72 hours of debate. It changed very little, but it took 72 hours of debate. The main debate, of course, is about the responsibility and accountabilities of, on the one hand, the investors and the other, the managers of the company. And that is very closely regulated, as it has to be. And again, there can be issues as which way it should be done. I think at this point, I also need to say that this role of the state is very different, however, from what one would call the command and control role of traditional socialism. It's not about saying, the state saying, this is how you should run your company, this is what you should be doing, and it's not about national planning or anything. It is just simply the state has to create the rules, the organizations, the institutions which underpin a market economy. And of course, so what it really is an enabling state. It's not either command and control of traditional socialism, nor is it an example of the minimalist state of neoliberalism. It is an enabling state which creates the conditions which are necessary for companies to grow and flourish. So it's not looking back nostalgically to Clause 4 socialism, nor to neoliberalism. Progressive capitalism, I think, is also a very useful way for policymakers and politicians to look at the world for two reasons. Firstly, I think it gives a very clear description of what the role of the state is in the economy. One of the most extraordinary features of the current political scene is that we have now the Secretary of State talking about an industrial strategy. The CBI has suddenly decided that we must have industrial policy, and the TUC continues to have a belief that industrial policy is very important. What is extraordinary about this is when I was in the DTI, if as a junior minister you'd said we ought to have an industrial policy, you would have been taken outside and shot on the basis that this is not the sort of thing that New Labour did. And of course you would have come under virulent attack from the CBI on the basis that picking winners is what the Labour Party did in the old days. It is totally to be deplored. And suddenly we've turned round. Now I think it's no clearer to most of us, if you read the literature, what actually an industrial policy is. People are just in favour of it. I think if you think about the issues I've been talking about, like national innovation systems, corporate governance, the education and training system, or indeed the institutions which underpin financial labour markets, there is a very clear role for what government should do, and I think that is the basis of the role of the state. If you want to call that industrial policy, you can. It does no harm, but you should be very clear about what it is that you're talking about. I think progressive capitalism also can help one to understand and in future prevent some of the things that have gone on in recent years, particularly the exploitation of pension funds and investors by asset managers, as has happened in recent years. If you look back over the 40 years before 2000, you'll find that the annual return to pension funds was a real return of about 5%. If you look at the returns, inflation-adjusted returns between 2000 and 2009, you'll see it's 1.1%. So it's 1.1% compared to 5% for the 40 years before. Now, you can give all sorts of excuses for this. You can say, well, you know, you have good decades and bad decades, and though a decade in these terms is quite a long time. But if you look at what was the profit and financial return of asset managers during this period, of course, it's never been higher. So you have a miserable return to pension funds and investors, huge profits being made by the asset managers. And this seems to me an extraordinary situation. In fact, just before 2008, 40% of corporate profits will be made by the financial sector, and under no circumstances, it seems to me, that can be justified. How did this come about? Well, it has a lot to do with the charges that asset managers make of pension funds and investors. These can range between 1% and 3%. It's incredibly difficult to get hold of the figures because asset managers are very keen to keep these figures to themselves, and it's very difficult to get a handle on them. But they range roughly from 1 to 3%. This may not seem very important until you work out that if it goes from 1% to 2%, over a 25-year life pension, that will reduce the final pension by 20%. So these are very significant figures. And I think it's a breakdown of our financial system that this was allowed to happen. I think the situation was well described by one investor who said, I knew I couldn't take the money with me when I died, but at least I thought it would be there when I retired. And that is the situation that we've had. And in my book, I talk about the ways that you might be able to make certain that actually investors and pension funds had proper information about what was going on. And I talk about a shareholders advisory board as being a way of dealing with this, as well as, of course, transparency. So what I've been saying, I think, can be summed up fairly simply. Progressive capitalism is based on a firm belief in capitalism, and the three defining beliefs of progressive thinking are that institutions are important, the state has to be involved in the design and reform of those institutions, social justice, defined as fairness, is an important measure of economic performance, and the enabling state, rather than command and control state or minimalist state, is the desirable one. Progressive capitalism, I think, will be dismissed by people on the extreme right and people on the extreme left on the basis that they will want to hold on to their ideological certainties. But I believe there are a lot of people in industry, government, professions, and even in financial markets who will see that progressive capitalism is the way forward and will demand the future government reform our dysfunctional institutions or economic institutions where they are dysfunctional so that they deliver economic growth, liberty, and social justice. Finally, as The Great Gatsby is a favourite book of mine, and as it's getting some attention at the moment, let me end with one, I think, a brilliant quotation from Scott Fitzgerald from that book. And he says, "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures, and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess that they had made." And I saw that quoted in a book about bankers and the financial crash, and it seemed to me that's a very good description of what happened in the financial crash. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. There are lots of interesting themes that I'm sure people in the audience will want to ask Lord Sainsbury about, and I'm going to start the proceedings by just raising a few issues and perhaps asking Lord Sainsbury to go maybe a little bit further on some of the matters that you touched on. So perhaps I could start with the issue of corporate governance, which you mentioned, and relations between shareholders and boards of directors, and the worry about short-termism, that boards are under pressure to meet quarterly earnings targets and neglect long-term investment. So what can we do about it? What are kind of realistic reforms that would, at any rate, reduce the extent of short-termism in the system, do you think?
Well, I think it comes back to this issue of you've got to bring the investors and the company together. And they become totally remote. Pension funds hands over its shares to asset managers to manage. The asset managers are turning them over merrily and investing on what actually is a zero-sum game, because if one investment manager does better, the other does worse. And actually the only way they can improve the performance of companies is by actually removing bad management, keeping control of the salary levels, making certain that they have a long-term strategy. And they, of course, do none of that, because if you're trading shares and you hold them for 6 minutes, or which is kind of quite long these days, or 3 months, you're not remotely interested in those issues. So you've got to bring them back. I think the first thing is to get the investors in the pension funds to start saying to the asset managers, we're contracting to you on the basis, A, you're not churning the shares all the time, because that doesn't help us, but you are taking an interest in the performance of the companies. And then I think there's a very good, very neat little mechanism in Sweden where they have nomination committees which nominate essentially the non-executives and the chairman of the company. And this is not a subcommittee of the board as we have it here, which is, of course, a nonsense. It's actually voted on by the AGM. So the nomination committee is a servant of the AGM, the shareholders, not a subcommittee of the board. And this is a very good way for major shareholders to make their views known and take action. Whereas today, if you're going to do that, you've got to try and find some like-minded investors, get along to talk to the managers and so on. I think this is a way you could do that.
Do you think, I think that one of your suggestions in the book, if I remember rightly, is that there might be a case for giving long-term shareholders more voting power. Do you think that's a possible way forward?
Well, I think one of the things that also has gone wrong is using takeovers too much in these situations. Now, there's a very good reason why you have lots of takeovers. The reason we have lots of takeovers is essentially you can make an absolute fortune out of this if you're an investment manager. So in the case I mentioned of the takeover for Sainsbury's, that eventually was seen off because the family thought it would endanger the long-term health of the business, because it would be loaded up with debt, and said we don't want to take part in this. And at that point, the investment bankers on both sides lined up and said there was a great plea: you must do this. It's a wonderful deal. It will be great for the company. And I remember thinking afterwards, why are they quite so enthusiastic about this? And then someone pointed out to me there was £100 million of fees on the table. If the deal didn't go through, they got nothing, and if it went through, they got 100 million. For, I have to say, not a great deal of work. And in those cases, you do say there have just been too many takeovers. The deal-making became the end of this. And I would like to see less takeovers. I think it's a rotten way to replace management of a company. If they're good, you get rid of them. But that's how we do it in this country too often with takeovers. And the way, I wouldn't want to stop takeovers, but I just think you want to put a bit of dirt in the wheels to make it more difficult. And two ways you can do that is to make have a higher requirement for acceptances in the target company. And the other way is to say, unless you can't vote unless you've held the share for 2 years. And that, I think, makes it more difficult. It doesn't rule it out if really people want to do it. It just makes it more difficult.
Fine. Okay, now, a different topic. You were very much involved when you were in government with science, innovation, new science-based businesses and so on. And I think during that period of the Blair and Brown government, at least up to the financial crisis, a lot of people thought that things were going rather well, and that the Labour government was providing all kinds of incentives for entrepreneurs to start new businesses, getting more money into venture capital and so on, encouraging universities to spin off new firms. So what more needs to be done? If there's a continuing weakness in that area, what additional steps could be taken to get more businesses, more high-growth, science-based businesses, do you think?
Well, I think we did do a lot, and I think as a whole it was pretty successful. I mean, if you look at, for example, the number of spin-off companies, not just spin-off companies, but any kind of knowledge transfer, licensing, doing projects for companies, over that period it was transformed. So it went from something like 70 spin-off companies a year to 250. But all those areas, licensing, everything else, improved. And towards the end, well, when I wrote a report for the government after I'd left called The Race to the Top. And we had some work done for that, comparing British universities against 3 top American universities in terms of the amount of knowledge transfer. Stanford, of course, still remains right at the top. But other than that, British universities now do pretty well on those measures against their American counterparts. I still think there's more you can do, and there's certainly a lot more you can do in those areas, whether it's the use of R&D funds of government departments. The Technology Strategy Board we set up has been a great success, but it should actually probably at least have 75% more money into it. And there are various other things. I mean, the coalition got rid of the regional development agencies. The truth is they weren't very good, but actually what should have happened is they should have been reformed, because you do need to have some kind of regional organisation to do technology policy in the regions. And LEPs are, they don't have any powers, and they don't have any money, and they don't have any people. But other than that, they're great.
Okay. You mentioned Stanford just then, and I think in your book, and you sort of touched on it in your remarks, you talk about different varieties of capitalism, and particularly, say, the German approach contrasted with the US approach. Now, at the moment, we seem to be going through a period when Germany is the model we should be imitating, whereas, 10 years ago, America was the model. And I wondered, what can we learn from these models? Obviously, Germany has immense strength in manufacturing industry. On the other hand, the United States seems to be ahead of the game in starting new businesses and so on. So, what, if anything, can we learn from studying these different types?
I think if you look at it over the period since the war. Every so often we sort of lose confidence in our model, and we then look at whatever country is doing well at that point and say we must be more like them. So I think it was originally French planning was the smart thing after war. Then, of course, we all thought Japan was the great place, and I went there a couple of times in the 1980s, and I thought this was fantastic, and this is what we should be doing. What, of course, I didn't even remotely understand was it had a kind of capitalism which is very socially determined and institutionally determined, and there's no way you can bring that to England. Then, of course, but we all thought that. I mean, the Americans spent a lot of time thinking, how can we be more Japanese in the 80s? Then, of course, the Japanese economy in 1990 goes in steep decline, at which point the Japanese start talking about how they can be more like the American economy. So you have a structure of a series of trade unions, and then they come together in major bodies. And if the major body says, we will agree to wage increases of 3%, that's what all the companies do, and the trade unions will follow the trade union leadership. There is no way we can produce such a system. We have 3,600 trade associations. Our trade unions, neither our trade association, trade unions, can make their members deliver on anything. So we had in the 60s, we had tripartite discussions. People would agree, great difficulty, agree something, but then no one paid any attention. So I think what comes out of that is you should look at what other countries do, but only try and copy from countries which have a kind of capitalism which is rather similar to your own, and that's for us, that usually is America. Okay. And we copied quite a few things in the Labour government. There's something called the SBRI system, which is about supporting small businesses with research grants from government. Hugely successful in America. With a great deal of effort, we got it into this country, and it's now producing quite well. So I think you copy, but only copy from someone who's roughly got the same kind of capitalism.
Okay. One last question then, which perhaps is an unfair one, I'm not sure. But you mentioned industrial policy has come back into vogue, at least rhetorically.
Right.
What do you understand by industrial policy? What sort of industrial policy would you like to see?
Well, I think it's all the things I was talking about. I mean, you've got to make certain that the labour markets and the financial markets have the right institutional underpinning to deal with some of the issues I've mentioned. You've got to make certain that your governance system is working. You've got to make certain that your national system of innovation, which is research institutes, universities, knowledge transfer mechanisms, your patenting system, all those are working efficiently, and you need to make certain your education and training system. Sometimes those will be horizontal policies, they apply to all industries, but obviously if you're talking about technology policy, you want to have technology policies for different industries, and you want to put those efforts into particular ones which you think where will have the most effect. And the same is true of education. Education, training, some horizontal policies, some sectoral policies. Right. If you start on that kind of basis, then I think you can have something which is clear and makes sense, whereas just talking about industrial policy as being, we want to do something to get growth going, doesn't seem to be very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well now I'd like to invite questions from the audience, and could I ask questioners to say who they are and their affiliation, if they could, and keep the questions sharp and short. Yes.
Hi, I'm Tony Richards. I'm just a student. You mentioned varieties of capitalism. That's kind of my focus in my studies as well. You mention you dismiss the German elements of the German model, specifically with regards to trade unions and using those as a means of training future apprentices. What would you then propose in that place? If that model can't be copied, then what would you propose in that place? And one of the other elements of the German model is there is a different type of welfare state. So in this country, the welfare state is designed to protect the low-income earners. But in Germany, it protects the high-income earners, which gives people an incentive to train in specific skills because they might be greatly rewarded, and market fluctuations will mean that they won't be penalised if the market changes. So would you support that latter part, and what would you do to create a training infrastructure in absence of that element of the German model?
You make me very happy. I'll go back and tell my wife that I met another person who was interested in the varieties of capitalism, because it's not often one finds someone else interested in the subject. The industrial training thing, I think you actually have to be rather creative in this, and because we can't do it in the way the Germans do it. But I'm involved in a scheme where we're trying to do something different, and what we're trying to do is use professional bodies to be the people who set the standards for the industrial training. The reason we haven't got a national standard is because it has to do these two things. It has to reflect the market. It has to work in the marketplace, and it has to be a national standard. So what we do in this country is sometimes we say the government will produce a national standard, which it does. Invariably, it has no relationship to what is needed by business. So we get rid of that, and then we have one which is done by, we say that we've got to get business to do it. So it relates to the need of business, but business hasn't got the expertise to produce national standards. So you get a few standards, but they apply only to particular companies, and they're not transferable skills. This is all about transferable skills. And so what we're in the process of trying to do is use professional bodies So you've got all the engineering institutions, for example, and get them to produce what we call a registered technician skill, which will be common across the board. It looks as if you can do that across engineering institutions. You can have registered IT people. You can have registered people in the National Health Service. You can apply these things even to areas like agriculture, where turns out there's a huge need for technicians. So you would have a common standard, a registered technician. And by and large, professional bodies are pretty good at making certain it works in the marketplace. And so that's what we're trying to do at the moment. And it'll be interesting to see whether you can do it. But I think you just have to be creative, because you can't do it like the Germans.
Okay, there's a question at the back. Just first. Then I'll come. Yes, please.
You talked about social justice as a measure of economic performance. Do you see that as a kind of supplement or a replacement for GDP or another measure of economic success?
I think it's another measure of economic success, because I think we would all agree, if you're interested in the well-being of society, this is what it's all about, I think we could all agree that if you had one society which has, say, 3% higher GDP than another one, but in the first one, it's almost all in the top 1%. I wouldn't call that a better society. I would call the other one, if it's evenly spread, a better economic result. And I think most people agree with that. I think where we need to think differently is left-wing people have tended always to say social justice is equated with equality. And this gets you into terrible difficulties. You can't run a market economy on the basis of equality. It's also not at all clear that this is what people want. So if you've ever been involved in trade union negotiations, I would guess you would never hear people talk about equality. They'll talk about equality between men and women, but they will never talk about equality between jobs as a whole, because people don't think like that. What they'll talk about a great deal is differentials. What is fair? And I think what has upset people and made people very angry in this recent situation is seeing, I mean, the one made people most angry was seeing bankers. Bankers made a lot of money and it seemed to be doing well. Everyone was reasonably relaxed. Where they became very angry is where the banks collapse, they're bailed out by the government, and then you see all the bonuses going on. And people quite rightly say this isn't fair. This is not a measure of the contribution they're making to the economy. And so while I think people are very relaxed about, someone who builds a business, creates lots of jobs, makes a great company, makes a lot of money, people say fair enough. But if people are involved in appropriation of wealth or just having bonus schemes which will give them huge rewards regardless of performance, I think people are very angry, and that's about fairness. People say it's not fair. And so I think we need to talk about social justice, but in the context of fairness, not equality.
Okay. The question just in front there, if you could. Yeah.
Thank you. David Badham, I should confess, sort of banking, financial services.
Right.
Two questions, please. First one is, do you think there is an industrial policy that would protect companies that maybe didn't have the Sainsbury family strength from the sort of takeover that only transferred or destroyed value that you described? And the second one is to do with unintended consequences. One thing you mentioned was, perhaps one would only be able to vote after 2 years of holding a share. Obviously, the intention is that makes holding it for longer than that more desirable. Is it not equally likely that people would bail out shortly before 2 years were up just so that they wouldn't have an additional responsibility, at least if they were asset managers?
Well, I think if they are asset managers, that might be right. I think the trick here is to make the long-term investors, which is what basically most investors and pension funds are, the people who are more involved in making those decisions. And I think that that's to be encouraged. Of course, there will be people who I think, who will bail out because, they say, nothing to do with us, we're just asset managers, and we don't want the extra hassle of all this. Okay, let them go, is my view. Is there a mechanism? I think one other thing I would very much seek to change is we have in this country a obsession with the idea that every shareholder should have exactly the same rights. I think if you look at company performance, you'll find that one of the reasons German companies and other countries, some other countries, you find very good performance is, on the contrary, that some group of shareholders has preferential shares or in some way works together as a family or as some organisation. And that works because they then say we have enough reason for actually taking action and doing something. So I think we just want to get away a bit from the everyone has the same rights. And if we can do that, you'll find there are more people who say my family or my group or just the 3 or 4 major shareholders take a different view.
Okay, I'll come back in 1 second. One question from the top there, please.
Hi, my name's Osman. I'm a postgrad student here at LSE. I've got 3 quick questions. What do you think the tax regime or structure would look like, ideally, in a progressive capitalist model, specifically in the UK? The second is you mentioned that the inequity of FTSE 100 director pay, but how does, say, the UK compete for global talent in a global market if there was a curb on that in a progressive model? And the third is how is Sainsbury's faring in adopting this kind of approach, if at all?
A tax regime. I don't think there's a particular tax regime that necessarily follows from this. On pay, this of course was the great argument. The great argument was, but we have to pay these amounts because we're competing against other people paying these amounts, which was a very convenient argument. Of course, the whole point was the whole system was essentially kind of rigged in this way. It just had started when I left Sainsbury's. It was just beginning to get out of hand. And the particular device which made this happen was remuneration consultants. So there was a great start made of remuneration consultants. Now, the first thing about remuneration consultants is, of course, they know, and you know, that if you're a remuneration consultant and you come along and you say the whole lot of you are vastly overpaid and there should be no increases, you do not remain remuneration consultant for that business for very long. Well aware of this, they then invented an incredibly simple little trick. The trick was, you come along to the board of directors and chairman and you say, where do you want your how do you value your executives? Do you want them to be in the top quartile, or the second quartile, or the third quartile, and the fourth quartile? And then you have your chief executive with his executives around him. What is he going to say? He says, I think I have the most wonderful team of people, and they should all be in the top quartile. Occasionally, a very brave chief executive might say it's in the second quartile. No one has ever said it should be in the bottom quartile. So, obviously, you have to bring your people up to the top quartile. Then you all go round again. The top quartile has, of course, gone up again, and the merry-go-round goes round again and again. And because there's no one representing the shareholders, this happy situation continues. Then you, of course, bring in what has turned out, which I have to say, initially you could say sounds quite a good idea, which is you link executive pay to shareholder value. This was the great fashion. So you say, it must be linked to the share price, and therefore you get an alignment between pay of executives and the shareholder. And if the stock market is going up very fast, that gives you huge increases. If it then falls, you say, well, we can't have a situation where our executives have got share options which are underwater, i.e. they're less than the current market price, because they've got to be incentivized. So you re-evaluate it and you put it down. And all this went on, and that's what gives you these extraordinary increases. It has very little to do with market forces. Sainsbury's has a fantastically good chief executive, very good chairman, as it had, and it's the same chief executive, the same chairman, as it had when the takeover took place, and it continues to do extremely well and to be very successful. It would not have been if it had been loaded with debt, and was always thinking, how can we make so we don't go bust because we got 90% debt?
Okay. Yes, please. Hold on one second. Hold on.
I'm Giovanna De Minico. I'm an Italian professor in constitutional law, so I belong to a different sector. Now I'm invited by LC. I appreciate a lot your speech, but I suppose perhaps I don't have understand very well one part, but I have a doubt. And so I pose this question. It seems that you've said that you absolve progressive capitalism of every sins. On the contrary, you charge financial system of every illegal behavior, but financial system is the mature son of progressive capitalism. And so I note this contradiction. Would you mind explaining me why? Thanks.
So what is the contradiction is between... So what is the contradiction between a view of progressive capitalism which wants to change the institutions of financial markets and the system we have where it breaks down?
No, in my opinion, the contradiction is when you've said at the beginning that progressive capitalism has brought wealth, good for everyone. On the contrary, financial system hasn't given good things. But in my opinion, if progressive capitalism has seen the same scene as financial system, because financial system is a product of progressive capitalism. That's all.
Right. Well, I think it's a misunderstanding due to my enthusiasm for progressive capitalism, because progressive capitalism doesn't exist. It's something that is a model that I've set up. And the problem we've had over the last few years is we've had essentially a neoliberal view, and this is what has caused the problems. And what I'm arguing for is a different system, which is progressive capitalism, which would treat these problems differently. Does that answer the question? Sort of.
Okay. Yes, question there, please.
Hi, my name's James and I work in asset management. I was interested on some of your comments on shareholder activism. In light of the move from defined benefit pension schemes and the trustee structure that we have in the UK, where there's already a huge amount of responsibility on trustees, and the move towards defined contribution schemes, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to how you actually increase shareholder engagement, because it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And you now have the UK Stewardship Code and ISS voting on behalf of asset managers. So it seems like asset managers are the people best placed to do it.
To do what? To do the stewardship of the...
To do the actual voting on behalf of particularly defined contribution pension scheme members, still being the largest segment of the institutional investment market.
Yeah, no, I mean, you essentially have to have that. You have to have the asset managers voting the shares. My whole argument is that hasn't been happening because the asset managers say, what's in it for us? We're not interested in the performance of the company long term. What we're interested in is, if you're doing computer trading, what you're interested in is the next 5 minutes. And a lot of them are interested in 3 months, 5 months. I mean, the turnover now is, 6 months average for a share, and that's a lot of them being turned over very quickly. They're not interested, and we've got to get back to a system. If you want capitalism to work, and you're justifying the fact that productive assets are held by individuals who will look after them, you've got to go back to a situation where investors require asset managers as part of their job to take that responsibility seriously. And I think you'll only get it if you have a contract which basically says that's what we require you to do.
Do you think that the stewardship code, which the Financial Reporting Council introduced last year, maybe, or the year before, right, are you optimistic about that? Do you think that's a step in the right direction? Or doesn't it amount to much?
Well, John Kay, who's probably the best analyst in this field, is very keen on these kind of duties and stewardship duties. I have to say, I may just be very cynical. I just think this is like kind of social responsibility. Everyone agrees to it, and does it have any effect? Not much when it comes to the crunch.
Okay. There's one question there, and then I'll come to you. Yes, please.
Daniel Sanderson, I'm a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. Do you think there is a case for extending the ability under the Enterprise Act to intervene in mergers and acquisitions on the grounds of public interest?
I, as a whole, not very keen on this because I think it's that in the end comes back to the Secretary of State for Industry, and I don't think their record has been very great in doing this. And as a whole, it's kind of part of my philosophy that these sort of things, you don't get decisions being made by the Secretary of State on public interest grounds, because normally that will not be the best grounds. And so I think this is one of the reasons why you say, no, this is a capitalist system. This is about the investors being the people who look at this. Now, there obviously always are a few real public interest situations which are to do with national security and that sort of thing. Leaving those aside, I would tend to leave it. I'd make it slightly more difficult to do the takeovers, but essentially leave it to the market.
Okay. In the same row, just if you could pass the microphone along. Same row as that.
Hello, my name is Swami and I work as a consultant for a payment business. 3 questions, I'll ask them quickly. Number 1, you have command economy on one extreme and you have the market economy on the other extreme. To me, progressive capitalism sort of feels like, in a simplified way, reaching out to the moderate position somewhere in the middle. Am I right in that? Question number 2, you included a number of good things as your solution. Including social justice, but I think, I haven't read the book, but I think you did not mention environmental justice, which is making sure.
Sorry, what kind of
environmental justice?
Okay.
Specifically, what is your opinion about attaching a monetary value to the natural resources, which definitely form a part of the means of production going forward? Do you agree to that or not? Third question. It's an irony that the land which was having the initial models of capitalism, the land of Adam Smith, is now looking to replicate or copy something from Germany or the America. My question is, why is it such a way? And what is Britain's contribution in the world of capitalism in the past, and what is it looking to contribute to capitalism itself in the future? Thank you very much.
It's rather a large set of questions.
Well, I contrast progressive capitalism with command and control on one side, traditional socialism, and minimalism at the other. But I think it's more than just kind of a sort of a compromise in the middle. This is not the third way, which was always kind of, this is a political positioning statement. We'll be neither this or this. It is that you want the state to have a role, but it's a different role from either of the two other models, and it's a defined role. So one is saying it's not just splitting the difference, this is what we want it to do. The environmental justice, I suspect I should have put something in about this, but I thought once you say markets are not some kind of abstract thing, they have their rules and regulations and costs attached to things, it's very easy to see how you take markets and you deal with traditional market failures to do with the environment. So you can either do it by legislation and say just you're not allowed to pollute, or if you do pollute, you have to pay. Once you see markets as being institutions, that's pretty obvious, and that's how we in this country are beginning to do this in terms of getting people to produce the energy, the new energy resources of the future. Germany, well, I mean, we were the people who really did the initial things on a new version of the origin of capitalism is very much in the UK. I think we haven't led the way enormously, but of course with progressive capitalism we've now got a chance to lead the way again.
Okay, yes. Yes, sir? Yeah. So, it's coming from the wrong end. Yeah, keep going. And then I'll go. So when you've finished, you can pass the microphone along. Okay. Of course, please.
Hi,
yeah.
My name is Aderbal. I'm a student. I wonder how progressive capitalism will treat tax havens, and also, do you expect that innovation and training can bring out economic growth, and economic growth that the economy needs? Because there is a strong tendency into stagnation, and without a bubble or another historical event, it seems quite unlikely that the current situation will change.
Yeah, I think you can. I think we've too much in the past just seen economics as being about allocation of capital and labour, and we've forgotten that you have to create the profit opportunities. You can have a great system of allocating capital and labour to the most profitable areas, but if you don't have any profitable areas, which is where you are in many developing countries, although they're very small, it doesn't get you very far. So I think one of the biggest arguments against the neoliberal approach is really companies play very little part in this. Companies by and large treated as black boxes, which just simply take their perfect information and turn it into the totally right production. Any idea of entrepreneurship, the skills and capabilities of firms are ignored. I think my model puts training and the national system of innovation absolutely in the middle of it. And I think you can say there's quite a lot of empirical evidence. Well, certainly on training of technicians, I can give you the references of studies which show. There was a guy, I think he was at LSE, called Professor Sig Price, who did in the 80s and 90s, did some brilliant studies in which he just took, in very specific areas, he took British companies and Dutch companies and Belgian companies, and he just compared productivity in a very narrow sector. And he had very good evidence that the quality of the technicians played a big part in this, so that you would just have badly maintained machines not being used for the right purpose, not proper feed systems in. And so training of technicians clearly relates to productivity, and innovation is absolutely central. I mean, we cannot compete against the Chinese on the basis of low costs in most industries, which are certainly in ones which are labour intensive. There's no way we can compete against them. When I used to go to China as a minister, their wage costs was 5-10% of ours. Today they're probably higher, 15, 20%, but no more. That means you cannot compete on a labour-intensive industry. You have to do it by having greater innovation and going into areas which are more complicated and difficult, sophisticated, require greater technical and organisational skills, and that's where the innovation becomes very important.
Okay, the question, then I'll go upstairs. Yeah.
Hi there, my name's Rob. I'm an economics teacher. I'd like to echo the sentiment that came from the front row, I think, a few questions ago. I think the confusion that I have, and I think that what's coming in the same question, is that the progressive capitalism that you describe, forgive me, but you say it hasn't happened yet, but I don't see any difference between what you describe and what we are currently living in. You support a capitalist system, but an interventionist government that essentially provides the correct outcomes. But that's what Thatcher would have thought she was doing. That's what Brown and Blair thought they were doing, and it's what the current government thinks that they're doing. So I don't see any difference, and maybe you could clarify exactly what you think the government is going to do, rather than you being in that position to choose those outcomes, because we're going to have to live with whatever government is put into that position. So your system, I think, is exactly what we're living in, the sort of thing that we're running into a problem with. Perhaps you could clarify what is the exact difference.
I think I should have, obviously I didn't make this clear. I mean, all the issues I've raised about how financial markets are not working and exploiting the investors, that we do not have a good system of corporate governance, that our technician training system is wrong, it doesn't work, that our national system of innovation is not as good as it should be. These are all failings of the current system.
Can I just say, so
yeah.
That's correct in hindsight. So Brown would have thought deregulation of the sector, which now led to this, was also the exact what you're describing is exactly what they thought they were doing at the time.
No, absolutely not. The whole point of the neoliberal philosophy is regulations and control of markets is not necessary. The greatest statement of this was Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, saying, "We've tried regulations, they never work." That was the whole philosophy of the period. Now, we didn't go that far. We said what we want is a light touch. But the signal we sent to regulators and others was, these financial markets, great success story of Britain, don't mess it up by regulation or control. So no, we certainly didn't do anything on technical education properly. As I say, we did do quite a lot on the national system of innovation. And corporate governance, we went along with what we, and pretty well everyone, thought was the best system, which was on the Cadbury report, where you would have an independent chairman and then lots of independent directors. And this way, you would control companies. It turned out to be, it didn't. It didn't work. And it didn't work because, as a whole, the independent it actually had some negative effects, which we had on the board of companies. Because to be independent, you had to show that, you were not the brother of the chairman and you hadn't worked in that company and so on and so forth. You actually ended up with lots of independent directors sitting on the boards of banks who had no idea about banking. In any case, who were appointed and paid by the chief executive. And it didn't work. I think this is still one where public opinion is way behind the reality of the situation. But the answer is, look at performance, and it didn't work. So all the areas I've been talking about, what I'm suggesting is just clearly different from what we were doing or what was happening at that point. Now, the question is, I think the difficult question is, well, why didn't you do something? And the answer is because business community, the politicians, above all the economists, said, we think this is the best system. We think neoliberalism is the best way to do this. This is what our textbooks tells you is the best way to run an economy. There was no one putting forward an alternative view. Yes, You could say you should have been smarter, but there were very, very few people who got it right. And I think you'll find there's a very good quote from John Stuart Mill, which he says, "It is extraordinary how in certain periods a view takes hold as to what is the right way to do things, and only people with superb intelligence and courage can break out of that, even though shortly after that period everyone agrees that the opinion was absurd." And if you look at it, look at the period since the war. After the war, we all thought that Keynesian views, that planning, that a mixed economy was the way to go. Now, people were more or less in that field, but there was no one talking about totally free markets. Then we had the stagflation of the 60s and 70s, and everyone realized that model wasn't working. I think they then made mistakes about saying it's something to do with Keynesianism, where it wasn't. It was to do with the rather foolish use of Keynesian ideas. And most people said we need something different. Neoliberalism came and filled that gap, and we've been living in that world ever since. But I think the time has come to change it.
And if I could just follow up that question for a second, because I think this is quite an important issue as to how radical your proposals are. Because when you've mentioned a few things like the training system or the corporate governance system or the national system of innovation and so on, couldn't one say that this is what you're asking for is kind of incremental improvement of what we've got, rather than some radical break with the past? I just wonder how you'd respond to that. In other words, how radical are your proposals?
Well, I'm deeply suspicious. When it always seemed to me in government, when ministers said, "I want a really radical policy," it usually meant they haven't the faintest clue what to do. And I don't believe that saying, "I want a radical policy," makes any sense unless you analyse the situation and say it's completely wrong. Now, if you look at the whole system and you say capitalism is terrible, let's go back to a nice command and control, let's have some national planning, that's your radical policy. I think the thing to do is to analyse the system, see where it's going wrong, and deal with those problems.
Yeah, okay. Let's go to the floor.
And there's rather a lot of evidence that suggests that's a better policy.
Okay. Yes. Well, I don't mind. You go first then, and then your neighbour.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm a student here at the LSE. Thank you very much, Lord Sainsbury, for the interesting analysis. I have a question with regards to the financial system. What is your take on taxing the trade of shares, i.e. financial transaction tax as proposed, for example, by Minister Schäuble in Germany, to reduce the myopic behavior of markets and to the same token, obviously, reward long-term shareholding? Thank you very much.
I think there's much to be said for this, but of course everyone has to do it at the same time, which makes it very difficult. It's clearly, there is a lot to be said for trying to stop this huge turnover of shares. I don't know what other people feel, but I think the whole idea of people in the city programming computers to essentially keep tabs on all share prices, find minute differences, and then the computer is programmed to find those, spot them, buy and sell some shares quickly, and move on. I mean, is this really what you think people should be making money out of the markets about? I don't. I think this is a business about trying to assess properly the performance of companies, and there's far too much turnover of shares. Probably you shouldn't turn them over more than a third every year. Of course, it's a very good way of making money, because if you keep turning over, the poor investor loses out on this. So I'm rather in favour of transaction tax. But you can't say our financial markets will have a transaction tax if someone else can do the same job without a transaction tax. So you've got to get an international agreement.
Just as a follow-up, isn't that the same argument they make about executive compensation also? Because if we do it, then
No, because I think one case, it's very clearly the case. As I was trying to explain on the executive pay, this is in a sense, everyone in a sense conniving at a system like this. And it's actually very, I mean, if you're interested in the history of this, there's some very interesting work which looks at, this admittedly is financial markets, which looks back at the ratio of payments in financial executives from the time of just before the Great Depression in America through to the current time. And it compares financial executives against people of similar educational qualifications. And just before the Depression, they were getting twice. Then as the New Deal came in, it went down to very near the same by the outbreak of war, and then in the 60s, and it stayed very similar. And then as deregulation came, it came up so that it got pretty close to where it had been before the Depression. And I think you'll see over the next years it will come back slightly. And that correlates almost exactly with an index of regulation. So I think it's quite possible that it will come back, and we should try and stop that happening again.
Okay. One other question from
Sam DeZoiser, I'm a tax advisor. My question is about fairness, and to me it sounds a little bit of a weasel word, in that fairness seems to be whomever is in power decides what it means. So if you look at South Africa or Zimbabwe, taking farms off white farmers to put them in the hands of black owners has not worked out very well, and has created, in South Africa, has created a class of black entrepreneurs that just happen to become fabulously wealthy simply by being in the right place at the right time. I just like to ask how fairness can really be a useful measure of value.
Well, I try to give a definition of this as being that rewards that people get are in some way calibrated to the contribution that they make to the economy. That was my kind of definition. I agree. If you just take the word fairness, anyone can interpret that to give you whatever answer you want. So I think it's like many of these words, unless you actually define what you mean by it, it doesn't make much sense. But I'm giving a definition of fairness as being the rewards you get relate to the contribution that you make to the economy. Very difficult to establish what that is, but at least you know that what you're trying to do probably is what people want and is actually an efficient way to run your economy.
I've just got a kind of repeat question that asks about whether you have any views about tax havens, which I think somebody did mention earlier. Is that something?
Right.
Is something that you feel is a bad thing that something should be done about it?
I mean, I don't think this can be open to doubt. I mean, you do not want to have tax havens, and you want people to pay the amount of tax that they should pay. And this whole system of letting these tax havens exists seems to me to be outrageous, really.
Okay.
I mean, but it's of course difficult because there's this whole question, again, unless all countries get together and stop it, it's quite difficult to do. But whether you want to have them, there can't be any question. You don't want tax havens.
I think probably we'll have time for one more question. Yes.
My name's Linda Murray. I'm from Wits University in Johannesburg. I'm curious to know a little bit more about your work with professional bodies. You said that you're working with them to look at standards, setting standards. What I'm curious to know about is if those professional bodies are also working with the training institutions, universities, etc., to set those standards, and if so, how that relationship is working out?
What we're dealing with is, of course, mainly technicians. And part of that, obviously, is the other two bits of this, which are how do you pay people while they get the qualifications and having places to do this. And this has to be, I think, FE colleges, essentially. And I think we've got to find a way to incentivize FE colleges to take this on. In the meantime, there is an extraordinarily good initiative called University Technical Colleges, which has been set up. I think it only has 2, but I think there are 23 in the pipeline, which is indeed essentially taking kids at the age of 14 and giving them a very good technical education so that they'll come out and, subject to a bit of experience, become registered technicians. And I think this is the last sort of bit of the building block in terms of how do you put a technical education system together.
Okay, we're almost at 8 o'clock, so I think we have to draw the event to a close. And as I mentioned earlier, Lord Sainsbury is happy to sign any books if anybody wants to come up and do that. So could I ask you to join me in thanking Lord Sainsbury for his excellent talk. Thank you very much.